The kitchen at Thornfield Park smelled of mutton fat and lye soap, and the particular exhaustion of a household preparing to receive a guest of consequence. Dorothea Hardcastle pressed a damp cloth against the inside of a copper pot and scrubbed in slow circles, her arms already aching from an hour at the scullery sink, the cold of the stone floor climbing through the worn soles of the shoes she had borrowed from the laundry girl. No one looked at her. That was the point. Upstairs, in the drawing room her father had ordered polished to an almost painful shine, Sir Edmund Hardcastle was at that moment explaining to the assembled household that the Marquis of Alverston would arrive before 5 o'clock, that he was one of the most eligible gentlemen in the county, and that Dorothea had consented to meet him at supper. He had not told the Marquis that she had also consented to arrive an hour before him and spend that hour watching the way a man behaved when no one he valued was present to observe it. She had presented the scheme to her father with the quiet certainty that had always unnerved him. She was 23 years old and had watched 2 friends enter marriages that had cost them everything, both of them too dazzled at the formal introduction to see what a single hour in the servants' quarters might have shown them. Her father had argued. Her father had warned her that it was irregular, that it was beneath her, that if the Marquis discovered her stratagem, he would be within his rights to withdraw entirely. Dorothea had listened to all of this with her hands folded in her lap and her expression unchanged. And in the end, her father had done what he always did when she wore that look, which was to give up and go to bed early. So she was here. Grease on her cuffs, a smear of ash along her left cheek that she had applied herself with her own fingers before descending to the kitchen. Her hair pushed under a linen cap that smelled faintly of flour. And she was waiting. The knock at the kitchen door came at 20 minutes past 4. The cook, Mrs. Bramley, did not look up from her pastry. "That'll be the Marquis's man come ahead to see to the stabling. Tell him the front door if he's bringing horses." Dorothea dried her hands on a rough cloth and went to answer it. He was not the Marquis's man. He was a tall man with dark hair damp from the ride and a coat that had been expensive before the rain got to it, and he had the kind of face that looked as though it had decided once, long ago, to give very little away and had been rigidly committed to that decision ever since. He was perhaps 34 or 35, broad-shouldered, and holding his hat in both hands, with the careful restraint of a person accustomed to being ushered through front doors, who was trying not to show that he knew it. "I appear to have come to the wrong entrance," he said. "You have," Dorothea said. "The front of the house is round. Follow the gravel." He looked at her for a moment. Not the quick dismissal she had learned to expect from men who had made up their minds about a girl in a kitchen cap before the sentence was finished. This was a different kind of looking, careful and unhurried, the kind that collected information rather than rendered verdicts. "Thank you," he said. She closed the door. Mrs. Bramley glanced up at last. "Who was it then?" "A visitor who came the wrong way," Dorothea said, and returned to the copper pot. If you have ever wondered what it would cost a person to stand in a cold kitchen and pretend to be someone she was not, while the man she was sent here to judge stood 30 feet away, forming opinions she could not yet read, stay with this story a while. Dorothea Hardcastle was about to discover that the problem with a scheme constructed entirely around observation was that observation, it turned out, ran in both directions. Sir Edmund Hardcastle had been a gentleman of moderate property and immoderate sentiment his entire life. He had loved his wife with a ferocity that had embarrassed his neighbors, and he had loved his daughter with an equal ferocity that had baffled his solicitor, who had been expecting him to concern himself rather more with the entail and rather less with whether Dorothea was permitted to read as long as she liked before bed. The consequence of this was a young woman who had been given the unusual education of being valued, who had therefore developed the equally unusual habit of expecting that value to be recognized before she surrendered it. The estate was not large. The income was not reliable. Since her father's illness the previous winter, which had left him with a cough that no physician had managed to silence and a pallor that no reassurance could entirely dispel, the question of Dorothea's future had become something heavier than theoretical. She knew this. She had gone over the accounts herself in the evenings, at the desk in the study he no longer climbed the stairs to reach, and she had understood the numbers with a clarity that hurt only a little. There was also the matter of her cousin Geoffrey, who stood to inherit the property under the terms of the entail, and who had been paying calls with increasing frequency and an air of confident entitlement that Dorothea found more distasteful each visit. Geoffrey was the sort of man who assessed rooms before people, and assessed women not at all in any manner that suggested he recognized the category as containing persons. The Marquis of Alverston had been proposed by her father's old friend Lord Pembry, who had known the Marquis since the latter's Cambridge days, and who described him as steady, intelligent, and in possession of a heart that was still there if you knew where to look. Dorothea had asked what that meant. Lord Pembry had cleared his throat and said that the Marquis had lost his wife 4 years previous, and had not, in Lord Pembry's considered judgment, recovered from it in the ordinary way, and that this was meant as a recommendation of depth, rather than a warning of incapacity. It had been enough to prevent Dorothea from saying no outright. It had not been enough to prevent her from arranging to spend an hour in his kitchen first. She was elbow-deep in a second pot when the back door opened again without a knock. She turned. It was the same man, hat still in hand. The coat had been brushed in the intervening time, she noticed, though the rain had left its permanent opinion on the shoulders. "Mrs. Bramley," he said, addressing the cook with a mild, measured courtesy that contained no performance in it. "I believe I owe you an apology. I came through the stable yard rather than the front, because I arrived earlier than expected, and I did not wish to arrive before the household was ready. I should have sent word ahead." Mrs. Bramley, who was not a woman easily surprised, blinked once. "That's no trouble at all, my lord." "I wonder," he said, "whether there is somewhere I might wait that would cause the least disruption. I am perfectly comfortable with wherever is convenient." He was not looking at Dorothea. He was addressing Mrs. Bramley with the complete attentiveness of a man who had concluded that the person in front of him was worth the whole of his attention. The cook, unused to this, seemed momentarily unsure what to do with it. "The sitting room off the hall is prepared," Mrs. Bramley said, "if you'll follow Mary to show you the way." Mary was the young kitchen girl currently occupied with the bread. She was 12 years old and had a streak of flour across her forehead, and she looked at the Marquis of Alverston with the blank terror of someone who had never spoken to a lord before. He noticed this. Dorothea watched him notice it. "There is no need to interrupt her work," he said. "I have already found the kitchen. I suspect I can find the hall." He found the hall. Dorothea set down her cloth. She had come here to observe a man who did not know he was being observed, and she tallied what she had found. He had apologized to a cook for the inconvenience of his own arrival. He had noticed a frightened child and spared her. He had made a small practical joke at his own expense. None of these things proved anything definitive about the deeper recesses of his character. She had not yet seen him irritated, or refused, or disappointed, or... She had not yet seen what he did with the edges of his composure when the situation gave him no graceful option. She would see it tonight. She excused herself to Mrs. Bramley with a murmured explanation about being needed upstairs, and climbed the back stairs to the room that had been prepared for her. where the housemaid was waiting with a gown of deep green silk that had been her mother's, and which Dorothea had altered twice. She washed the grease from her hands. She unpinned the linen cap and let her hair down, and then put it back up properly, with the pearl combs her father had given her on her 20th birthday. She wiped the ash from her cheek. She looked in the glass and saw the daughter of the house where the kitchen girl had been half an hour before. Then she went down to supper. He was standing at the fireplace in the drawing room when she entered, turning a small enameled snuff box end over end in his fingers, in the manner of a person who needed something to do with their hands when nobody was looking. He stopped when she came in, and something passed across his face that she could not yet name, swift and quickly mastered. "Miss Harcastle," he said, "I am James Vainsby, Marquis of Alverston. I believe your father has told you something of me." "He has," she said. "I confess I know less of you than I might wish." "That is quite honest," he said. He seemed to weigh something. "I feel I should confess the same." Her father descended the staircase at that moment, moving more slowly than he once had, and the supper began. She had expected him to perform. Most men of consequence performed at supper with a family they were considering joining. They told carefully shaped stories that cast themselves in a flattering light, asked questions designed to demonstrate their interest in her while actually demonstrating their interest in the correct answers, and addressed her father as the authority and Dorothea as the consideration. She had been to enough of these suppers in the homes of her friends to know the shape of the performance before it started. He did not perform. He asked her father about the property with the straightforward curiosity of a man who found land genuinely interesting. And when her father mentioned the difficulty of the Northfield drainage, he listened with the focused attention of someone who intended to think about it later. Her father, who had spent years receiving the polite inattention of men who wished to conclude the business portion of an evening quickly, warmed to this in a way she recognized with a small ache. The way a person leans toward a fire after a long time out of doors. He told the Marquis about the original survey of the property, which had been conducted badly and which Sir Edmund had been correcting piece by piece for 30 years, and the Marquis said that he had encountered similar problems at his own estate and asked 3 specific technical questions that suggested he knew something about drainage beyond its general inconvenience. Over the second course, he asked Dorothea whether she read French, and when she said that she did, he asked what she was reading. And when she named a recent volume of natural philosophy, he said that he had read it, and found the 3rd chapter somewhat speculative, and the 4th quite sound. And she said that she had found the 3rd chapter the more interesting precisely because it was speculative, and he paused, and then said, "Yes, I can see the argument for that." He did not say it with the gracious accommodation of a man conceding a point to keep the conversation pleasant. He said it as a person says something they have just genuinely concluded, the words landing at a slightly different angle than the one he had entered the sentence with. She noted this. The dining room was small and lit by a good fire and 6 candles in the silver branches her mother had bought at considerable sacrifice, and which her father brought out only when he wanted something to go well. The linen was pressed. The soup was better than usual, Mrs. Bramley having exerted herself in a way that reflected the household's collective understanding of what the evening was for. The Marquis appeared to notice none of the effort and appreciate all of it. He was not easy. There was something behind his eyes that stayed at a careful distance. Not unfriendly, but not fully present, as though a portion of him were attending some other conversation she could not hear. She recognized this. She had read it in Lord Pembry's description as clearly as if the word had been written out. He was a man who had once let himself be known, and had not recovered from where that had led. She did not push at it. She had not come here to be charming. She had come here to see. After supper, her father, who was managing his fatigue with heroic pretense, made his excuses and retired, and Dorothea found herself alone with the Marquis in the drawing room, which was not strictly proper. But her father had decided some years ago that Dorothea's judgment was worth more in most situations than strict propriety, and had left them to it. He stood at the window and looked out at the garden, which was dark and offered nothing in particular to look at. "I should tell you something," he said, without turning from the glass. She waited. "I was informed by Lord Pembry that you are a person of considerable intelligence and rather less patience for evasion than is usual," he said. "I find I prefer to honor that by saying directly that I am not certain I am the man your father believes me to be in terms of what I am capable of. I was 4 years ago. I am less certain now. It was the barest possible beginning of a wound named. He had not described the wound itself. He had only told her, in the clearest available terms, that it was there. I find that more honest than anything else you might have said," Dorothea told him. He turned from the window. He looked at her with the same quality of looking he had given her at the kitchen door, that careful collecting of information that rendered no quick verdict, and she felt it now in the drawing room exactly as she had felt it in the kitchen, which was to say that it landed in her chest with a warmth she had not expected. "You have ash on your neck," he said. "Just below your left ear." The silence stretched between them with the specific quality of a silence that both parties are choosing not to fill, because filling it would mean going somewhere they had not yet decided to go. "I had occasion to spend some time in your kitchen this afternoon," Dorothea said. His face did not change. Not visibly. There was a slight adjustment in his expression. A careful recalibration. The kind of thing you would miss if you were not watching closely. She was watching closely. "I see," he said. "I imagine you have conclusions about what that means," she said. "I imagine you are waiting to hear whether I will voice them or whether I will wait to see what you say first," he said. "Both," she said. A pause. He crossed to the chair opposite her and sat down, as a man settles in when he has decided to stay for a while. "The girl at the back door," he said, "who told me to use the front." "Yes." "I thought you were capable," he said. "I noticed that. You told me exactly what I needed to know in a single sentence, and wasted nothing." He was quiet for a moment. "I wondered why someone would put a capable woman in a kitchen." "I put myself there," Dorothea said. "Yes," he said. "I think I understand that now." If it had been another kind of man, he would have been angry. She had seen anger performed in this exact situation, in the drawing room of a friend, when a girl had been found to have exceeded the terms of the agreement. The anger had not been about the deception. It had been about the disruption of the expected arrangement of authority. "You will sit where I put you and be what I need you to be." And the rage when a woman declines to do that is rarely about the deception at all. He was not angry. He looked, if anything, like a man who had walked into a room expecting a portrait and found instead a window. "You wish to know whether I was tolerable when no one important was watching," he said. "I wish to know whether you were kind," she said. "Tolerable is easy to manage for 3 hours at supper. Kindness is harder to perform in a kitchen." Something shifted in him at that. Not a large thing. The sort of shift that only registers if you have been paying close attention. A slight loosening somewhere in the vicinity of his jaw. A breath that came and went as though it had been held slightly longer than comfortable. "And your conclusion," he said. "I have not reached one," she said. "I have reached a willingness to continue gathering information." He looked at her. The fire had burned low. The room smelled of candle wax and the cold that was beginning to press through the window glass. "That is more than I expected to have this evening," he said. It was not a complaint. It was, if she was reading him correctly, and she thought she was, something close to relief. She should tell you what she had not told her father, which was that the scheme had not begun with suspicion. It had begun with fear. Not fear of this man in particular, whom she had not yet met, but fear of the category of arrangement she was about to enter, which was to say an arrangement in which she would be valued for the qualities she displayed at supper and managed thereafter for the qualities she had kept quiet. She had seen it happen to her friends. She had watched women she admired become smaller, season by season, in houses where their smallness was what had been wanted all along. She had decided that if she was going to enter such an arrangement, she would do it with her eyes open, and that the only way to open them fully was to see the man before he knew he was being seen. This was the logic. It was sound logic. It had one flaw, which was that it had not accounted for the possibility that the man, upon being told he had been seen, would not retreat into a front, but would instead sit down across from her and look at her as though she were precisely what he had come here hoping to find. She had not planned for that. The following day he called again. Not for supper. In the morning, in the cold, with mud on his boots from where he had apparently dismounted at the gate rather than the drive, and he had brought a slim volume that he left on the hall table with a note that read, in full, that the 4th chapter, which he conceded was less interesting than the 3rd, was enclosed for her consideration. He did not stay. He gave his compliments to Sir Edmund through the housemaid, and departed before Dorothea, who had been in the study when he arrived, came down the hall to find only the book and the small square of folded paper beside it, and the particular quality of cold air that enters a house when someone has just left through the front door. She picked up the book. It was a different volume by the same natural philosopher, the one that had preceded the one she had named at supper, slimmer and more worn at the spine, the kind of wear that comes from being read rather than kept. She opened to the 4th chapter and found, in the margin, a small penciled mark beside a sentence she did not yet know, the mark made by a previous reader, someone else entirely, decades ago. She did not read the sentence then. She closed the book and stood for a moment in the hall, with the cold smell of outdoors still in the air. She read both chapters that afternoon with the book in her lap and the fire at her feet and a slow warmth in her chest that she catalogued and did not yet allow herself to name. He called 3 times that week. Each time he arrived through the front door. Each time he stayed no longer than propriety strictly required. Each time he spoke to her with the same quality of attention he had given Mrs. Bramley, which was to say full and unstinting and entirely absent of performance. He told her, on the 2nd visit, that his estate at Alverston was large and frequently cold, and that he had not, for the past 4 years, particularly minded the cold. She did not ask him what had changed. She noted it. On the 3rd visit, he asked her whether she would walk with him in the garden, and she said yes. She fetched her heaviest shawl, and he waited in the hall, and they went out into the frost-hardened paths in the gray afternoon light. The dead stems of the roses bent under their own weight, and the gravel crisp underfoot. There was no sun. The sky sat low and even over the hedgerows. He had thought further about the Northfield drainage, as she had suspected he would, and he described his conclusions with the same measured precision he brought to everything. A slight gesture with one hand when the explanation required it, his breath visible in the cold air. She offered the 2 adjustments she had already noted from the accounts. and he considered them without the particular silence men sometimes produced when a correction arrived from an unexpected direction. He simply thought about them for 4 or 5 paces, and then said that the second adjustment was sound and would cost less besides, and that he had not seen it from his angle. She noted that he said so without any performance of concession. It was merely the next thing he had concluded. They walked without speaking for a stretch that lengthened past awkwardness and into something else. The garden at this time of year was not a decorative thing. It was a practical one. The beds prepared for winter, the paths unadorned, the whole of it committed to endurance rather than display. She found that she did not mind sharing the silence with him. She was accustomed to silences that required management, silences that accumulated pressure until someone said something to discharge it. This one sat still between them and asked nothing. "You are quiet," he said at last, not as a complaint. "I was noticing that the silence was comfortable," she said. "I thought that was worth not filling." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. It was his smallest word and his most complete one. Her cousin Geoffrey appeared on the 4th day, unannounced, in the manner that he frequently appeared, which was to say without the courtesy of a prior note, and with the air of a man who considered that his eventual inheritance of the property entitled him to treat it as already his own. He found Dorothea in the morning room with a ledger open on the desk, going over the estate accounts. He found the Marquis of Alverston in the chair by the window, reading, a detail which appeared to produce in Geoffrey a rapid and unpleasant recalibration. "I had not expected company," Geoffrey said, in the tone of a man who meant the opposite. "Good morning, Mr. Harcastle," Dorothea said. "This is the Marquis of Alverston. He is calling on my father." "Your father is upstairs," Geoffrey said. "He will be down presently," Dorothea said. Geoffrey turned his attention to the Marquis with the assessing gaze he brought to rooms and objects, and the Marquis looked up from his book with the polite and absolute composure of a man who had encountered entitlement often enough to have a well-worn method for it. "Mr. Harcastle?" the Marquis said, and returned to his book. Geoffrey opened his mouth and then closed it. The Marquis did not look up again. Geoffrey stayed for 20 minutes, during which he was not precisely rude and not precisely welcome, and departed with the air of a man who had come expecting to find territory unclaimed and found instead a boundary he had not been consulted about. The door closed behind Geoffrey with a sound that was entirely ordinary and somehow final. Dorothea did not look at the Marquis. She was aware of him the way she had been aware of him in the kitchen, as a specific presence at the edge of her attention that she was choosing not to turn toward. She was aware of the quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of a man who had nothing to say, but of a man who had decided to wait for the right moment to say it. She was aware of her own pulse, which had not quickened for Geoffrey, not even in irritation, but was doing something now that she attributed to the charged residue of the scene rather than to its audience. She was not certain she believed this. She went back to her ledger. "Your cousin," the Marquis said from the window. "Yes." A pause. "How long has he been making himself at home here?" "Since my father's illness became apparent to people outside this house," she said. The Marquis turned a page. "I see." She almost smiled at that. It was so precisely calibrated, so exactly the minimum word required to convey that he understood what she had said and had formed an opinion about it, without offering commentary she had not asked for. She was beginning to understand that this was how he communicated the things he would not say aloud, in the selection of the word that named the thing without decorating it. She put down her pen. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what you told me the first evening, about what you are uncertain you are capable of." He did not answer immediately. The fire settled. Outside, the late autumn garden was gray and still. "I know what I am uncertain of," she said. "I would like you to know it too, if we are to be honest with one another. I am uncertain whether I am capable of entering an arrangement that requires me to be less than I am. I have seen what the requirement does to women over time. I have decided I would rather remain without the arrangement than enter one that asks that of me." He set the book down. "I lost my wife to a fever," he said. "In the spring of 4 years ago. She was 28 years old." He paused. "I had not been a good husband to her in the way that I might have been. I was correct and attentive and responsible. And I loved her. And I did not tell her so nearly enough. Because I believed that demonstrated love was more durable than spoken love. And I was wrong about that. And she died not knowing the full weight of it." He stopped. His hands were still on the closed book. "I do not know how to try again without being afraid that I will make the same error in the other direction, overcorrecting into declaration without substance." The fire was the only sound in the room for a moment. She had been told things about men before, by women who loved them, by men who wished to be understood. She had been told things intended to excuse, and things intended to explain, and things that were simply true, and therefore required no purpose beyond being named. What he had just told her was the third kind. He had not told it to justify the distance she had sensed behind his eyes. He had not told it to ask her to manage his grief around her own expectations. He had told it because she had said she wanted honesty, and he had decided, in the calculating fashion she was coming to recognize as characteristic, that the most efficient form of honesty was the thing he most needed to say. She sat with it for a moment. The room smelled of wood smoke and old wool and the particular closeness of two people in a small space who have stopped performing for one another. "That is a very specific and human fear," Dorothea said. "Yes," he said. "I do not think the antidote is declaration or restraint," she said. "I think the antidote is the kind of attention you gave to a woman in a kitchen who told you to use the front door." He looked at her. "You saw me," she said, "before you knew there was anything to see. You gave me exactly the kind of attention I am describing. The kind that does not require the other person to be valuable on your terms before it can be offered." He was very still. "I am telling you," she said quietly, "that I have been watching you for 10 days. And what I have seen is a man who gives that quality of attention as a matter of habit, without theater, to everyone in any room he occupies. I do not think that is something that requires repair." Something moved across his face then, that she had not seen there before. Not the careful recalibration, not the measured guard. Something underneath it, something that had been waiting for room to surface. "Dorothea," he said. He used her given name, and he said it with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood exactly what the first use of it meant. "James," she said, and meant it the same way. He crossed the room in 2 strides and took her hand, not lifting it, simply holding it in both of his with the specific restraint of a man who has decided to say something without words first, and then find the words later. His hands were warm. Her pulse quickened in a manner she did not attempt to explain away. "I want to propose a continuation of the arrangement we have apparently been conducting," he said, "in which you observe me and tell me what you find, and I tell you what I find, and we proceed on the basis of what is actually true rather than what is expected to be true." "That is the least conventional proposal I have ever been informed of," she said. "Is it a sufficient one?" he said. "It is," she said. Outside in the hall, Her father appeared at the top of the stairs, moving slowly, and made no particular haste to descend, because he was a man of considerable sentiment. And he knew, from the quality of the silence coming from the morning room, that his daughter had done what she always did when given enough time and sufficient latitude, which was to find the exact right conclusion, by a method entirely her own. He sat down on the top step and waited, and smiled at nothing in particular. The formal announcement was made at the assembly rooms in the village at the end of that month, at a small private dinner Lord Pembrey had arranged with the transparent pleasure of a man who has done exactly what he intended and wants everyone to know it. The guests included a dozen of the county's most reliably thorough gossips, which was not Lord Pembrey's intention, but was the inevitable consequence of inviting 12 people to anything. Lady Whitmore was among them. She was a friend of the late Marchioness's mother, and had been vocal in the preceding weeks about her concern that the Marquis was moving with unseemly haste, and her further concern that Miss Harcastle was not, in her view, the appropriate quality of match for a man of his standing. She had voiced this opinion to 3 separate parties in 3 separate drawing rooms, using the phrase, "a very ordinary young woman from a very ordinary estate," with the practiced precision of a weapon deployed so gently its target was expected to be grateful. Dorothea had heard it. It had arrived in the 3rd instance through a well-meaning friend who had relayed it with the apologetic helplessness of someone who knew she was delivering an injury and could not stop herself. She had received it without visible reaction. She had thought about it for an evening and then set it down, not because it did not sting, but because she had decided some years ago that the metric of other people's categorization of her was not a reliable instrument, and she saw no reason to start trusting it now. At the dinner, Lady Whitmore positioned herself near the drawing-room door and watched the Marquis with the careful attention of a woman gathering evidence. She found him courteous to everyone and demonstrably attentive to no one in a way that would confirm her thesis, and this seemed to frustrate her. Then Dorothea came in from the hall, and the Marquis turned from his conversation with Lord Pembrey and crossed the room without any particular hurry, and stood at her side as though that were the position he had been intending to occupy all evening. And Lady Whitmore, who had very good eyes, observed something in his expression when he looked at Dorothea that she had last seen on a man's face, when he looked at something he considered entirely and irrevocably his. The announcement was made after the 3rd course by Lord Pembrey, who enjoyed announcements with the enthusiasm of a man who has been anticipating this one for some time. The table offered the appropriate warmth of response. Lady Whitmore said nothing. Her fan moved in a measured arc at approximately half an inch too high, and then she set it down and looked at Dorothea with the particular expression of a woman who has concluded that she miscalculated and knows it, and intends to do something useful with the knowledge. "Miss Harcastle," Lady Whitmore said across the table, "I owe you a better introduction than I have made." "Lady Whitmore," Dorothea said, "I believe we are already acquainted." A pause. The Marquis at her side said nothing. He was very still. "Quite," Lady Whitmore said. "Then I shall say only that I expect you will be very well suited. You are rather more than I had accounted for." There was a moment in which the table, without quite knowing why, held its breath. "Thank you," Dorothea said. She meant it without sharpness and offered it without triumph. That was all that was required. The winter that followed was a good one, which is to say that it was cold and difficult in all the ordinary ways and good in the ways that mattered. Sir Edmund Harcastle's cough improved with the physician's new treatment and the Marquis's discreet conversation with a colleague in London who knew the right man, which Sir Edmund accepted with a gruffness that was his form of gratitude. The Northfield drainage was resolved through a practical scheme that the Marquis had worked out on paper and Dorothea had improved with 2 adjustments she had noted from the accounts, and neither of them made any particular comment on this division of labor because it seemed to them both entirely natural. Geoffrey came once more, and then did not come again. She found herself, in the early weeks of the year, in the library at Alverston, which was large and cold, as advertised, and full of books that had been accumulated across 3 generations by people who had read them with the intention of arguing about them at length. She was deep in a history of the wool trade, which she had found on the 3rd shelf, and which had nothing to do with anything she was meant to be reading, when James came in from the estate meeting and found her there and stopped in the doorway. She did not look up immediately. She had learned, in the month since the morning room, that he liked to watch her read. She had learned this by paying attention, which was her primary method of learning things. And she had filed it alongside everything else she had gathered about him during the experiment she had not stopped running, because she did not think she would ever stop running it. Not as suspicion, as a form of caring so thorough that it never quite stopped noticing. "The 4th chapter," he said from the doorway, meaning that he was here, and she was here, and this was sufficient. She turned a page. "The 3rd," she said, meaning that she knew. He came into the room and sat in the chair beside her, and picked up the letter he had set down before the meeting, and did not read it yet. Because the fire was warm, and the library was cold past its circle of warmth, and she was 3 feet away, and the house they were in the very early stages of building had, among its other contents, this specific kind of quiet. He had told her once, on a cold evening in November, what the portraits on the upper gallery meant to him, and what the piano in the music room had meant to Eleanor, and what his silence when he passed that door was made of. He had said it in the few exact sentences of a man who does not have the habit of saying such things aloud and knows it. She had listened to every word without filling the space after it, because some things needed to be set down in a room and allowed to be present without being immediately resolved. She had understood then what it had cost him to say it at all. She carried it now, as she carried most things she had gathered from him, carefully, without display, in the interior spaces where the things that actually mattered to her lived. Outside, the January light was falling across the stone of the south terrace in long, pale angles. The book smelled of old paper, and the particular cold of a room that heats slowly and holds its warmth late into the night. The fire made its quiet sound. He reached across without looking and set his hand over hers, briefly, the way a person touches something to confirm it is still there. She turned another page. The pearl combs her father had given her sat on the dressing table upstairs, beside the linen cap she had kept. She was not sure entirely why she had kept it. Some objects earn their place not by their beauty, but by what they were present for, by the specific morning they belonged to, and the thing that morning had started. She had put it in the top drawer, and there it had stayed. And sometimes in the early hours, when the house was quiet and she was not yet entirely awake, she thought about a kitchen that smelled of mutton fat and lye soap, and a man standing at a door with his hat in both hands, and she thought about how many things depend, finally, on who is paying attention. The fire burned low. James set his letter down. She put a marker in the book. Outside, the snow was beginning to fall, very quietly, in the way that winter announces itself in the English countryside, without spectacle, with only the slow, reliable accumulation of something that will still be there in the morning. If Dorothea's story has stayed with you, leave a word in the comments for the thing that made you stay. Thank you for being here until the end.